Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Hannah, and today I will be talking about my term paper titled Applied Maxims in Public Finance, a comparative study between Islamic and Western perspectives. Before we begin to the rest of the content, let's first try to define what applied maxims essentially mean. In this particular paper, I intend applied maxims to be guiding principles or rules used by these economists to come up with the public finance system they have suggested. The purpose of this, or the purpose of knowing the applied maxims, is to understand where they're coming from and what their intentions are when they're creating this public finance system. When you are able to recognize their thought process, you're able to understand what exactly is the purpose of a public finance system in these two perspectives. For example, we take Islamic perspective, they often have Qawaid al-Fiqhiyah, which is used as a Sharia guided principles when coming up with legalities of anything. And this extends to public finance as well. However, when we contrast this to Western perspectives, this might not exist. They do not have their set of religious scriptures that provide this guideline. So the question is, how do they come up with these maxims or guidelines? I'm going to compartmentalize my content into 4 separate parts. The first is that we'll be looking into the sources of how they obtained the applied maxims that the economists use. Secondly, we'll be looking at the role of state. What are their maxims when applying what exactly the role of state is in public finance? Thirdly, with regards to public revenue, what are their maxims when they are looking for systems to collect public revenue? And finally, public expenditure. First and foremost, let's go and talk about sources. As you all know, in Islam, we have the Quran and Hadith as guiding texts whenever we want to innovate anything in our lives. So, like we know, a lot of the past economic scholars of Islam, for example, Abu Ubaid, use Quran and Hadith a lot in their writings. For example, Kitab al-Amwal talks a lot about the semantics of the Quran, how exactly the Quran defines anfal, or how exactly the Quran defines certain words. And that becomes the premise of how he built a lot of the maxims that he suggested in his book. Similarly, we see him use, for example, prophetic income to create the categories of revenue. So this goes to show how Quran and Hadith is a very present source of how Islamic economics come up with their maxims. Let's contrast this to Western perspectives. Often they use logic and introspection. It's not to say that Muslim scholars do not use logic and introspection. It's just to say that they are bound by the Quran and Hadith. This is something that Western scholars don't necessarily have. They are not bound by any religious scriptures. They are not bound by any set of ethics. They often have to use their logic to come up with their own version of ethics and therefore their own applied maxims. How do they do this? They often do this by creating assumptions, similar things like we learn in economics. They do this by, for example, putting themselves in an impartial position to try to decide what is the most ethical point of view or what is the most ethical maxim to be applied. So that's in terms of sources. The second is in terms of role of state. Now, in terms of role of state, you will start to notice that the similarities start to shrink between Islamic and Western perspectives. The principles when it comes to Islam is that the role of state is the administrator of public finance. How do I extract this? This came from Abu Ubaid's definition of what public finance is, which is basically a various group of public property that are administered by the government and utilized for public benefit. So it goes to show that government, based on this definition, is only meant to be an administrator. They're not meant to own the property. They're not meant to be able to be authoritarian with the property, but however, they're the administrator for the sake of public benefit. And let's contrast this to what is set in Western perspective. Adam Smith curates this idea that the state is meant to be two things: the productive state and the protective state, which is basically means that they have roles to fulfill as state and obligations to fulfill. This is of course because Adam Smith believes that state intervention should be as limited as possible, and therefore they should only intervene when necessity, and therefore these two scenarios are the necessity. This goes hand in hand with Islam, in which state exists because of a necessity and not to be extended to things beyond their duties or obligations. Thirdly, public revenue. What do we think about public revenue? In terms of Islamic perspective, public revenue, there are not a lot of maxims or not a lot of guiding principles that allow innovation. Because if you notice, from the time of the Prophet, or for example, the ruling of Caliph Umar, a lot of systems of public revenue have already existed. So often in Islamic studies, they look into public revenue in terms of the rates of how much they ought to charge, or things like, for example, what is the difference between Haraj and Ushur land? So there isn't much room for maxims aside from the usual analysis of the legality of a certain action. But a lot of the items with a lot of issues with regards to public revenue require a more specific and detailed analysis on how you're going to implement a lot of these things, which again use Quran and Hadith as the reference. Contrast that to Western perspective, where they have to create maxims to create this guideline of ethics that don't exist in any scripture. They have to create it. So Adam Smith suggests 4 things: equality, which means that every participant of the nation has to pay in proportion to how much they benefit from the nation. Secondly, certainty, to say that you cannot create random rates, which is actually very similar to Islam. For example, the zakat rate of 2.5%, it cannot be randomly decided by a governor. Thirdly, in terms of convenience, you must collect at the convenient time. Do not collect at times where the people are unable to pay, because that's just counterproductive. And fourthly, economy and collection. It's to always hold the intention that the state has to take as little as possible from the people in terms of collecting public revenue. These are maxims, if you notice, that are actually applied in Islamic perspective as well, except they often use Quranic references and more technical discussions surrounding it, as opposed to philosophical discussions, such as ones we see in Western perspectives. Lastly, we talk about public expenditure. Now, public expenditure is where they are actually very much in line. The Western perspective actually takes on the idea of public benefit. Public finance is meant for public benefit because of certain ethical reasons. The contrast is Islamic perspective, which definitely prioritize the idea of maslahah. We take maslahah or public benefit as a priority because even in definitions of public finance, we see that the goal of public finance is for public benefit. And therefore, what do they spend on? These are things like, for example, we can use Adam Smith's to integrate the two, is the idea that the productive state is meant to create a government is meant to assist an economy in creating a productive state, or the protective state where they spend on, for example, defense, where they protect the people. All in all of these things, infrastructure, roads, bridges, schools, should at the end of the day benefit the public and not certain individuals in government, or for example, parties like the monarch, which could potentially be something that was practiced later on in the Western world, or sometimes even in the Islamic world as of now. So if we notice, all of these maxims might not be a reflection of what is practiced in the Islamic world, nor the Western world, because obviously economies don't have full power to decide what governors choose, and governors can sometimes be corrupt or biased. Therefore, we have to take these applied maxims to understand the essence of public finance for both of these. So an integrated approach isn't one that is very hard to actually attain. Of course, first and foremost, we have to assume that it's a secular government, because right now in the modern world, there are governments that are not necessarily Muslim governments. Once we have that, we can combine these applied maxims in creating an ethical system of public finance in order for us to all reap the benefits, and in order for public benefit to be the primary reason public finance exists. At the end of the day, of course, there's a priority in reaching global frameworks or global goals like the UN SDGs. With a good public finance system, we can reach things like, for example, zero poverty, SDG number 1, or SDG number 2, zero hunger. All of these things, like the SDGs, become a direct and indirect implication of applying an ethical public finance system. And that should be something that we all pursue as a community. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.